Now, parallel to this economic revolution that we've been talking about, there's also a political, or I should say, multiple political revolutions that are occurring in Europe. Now, in one thing we talk about in History 121, the preceding course is the Protestant Reformation. And I'm just going to review a little bit about it, focusing not so much on religion, but on how it led to the rise of centralized states. So the Protestant Reformation, which we often connect with Martin Luther, who nails his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church in 1517, kind of challenging Catholic teachings. This Reformation begins as a desire to reform perceived corruption within the Catholic Church. It's going to lead to a Protestant Reformation and wars as well, because in this time period, religion, politics, and war are tightly connected. Now, if you were to ask yourself, well, who won these wars, which were often between Catholics and Protestants? And I would answer, the government did, the state did. Because what happens as a result of the Protestant Reformation, in a sense, is now you have what had once been a unified Western and Central Europe under the Catholic Church. You now have multiple churches. The Catholic Church is still there, but now you have Lutherans, you have Presbyterians, you have a lot of different kinds of Christians. And because now you have a divided church, this allows governments to become more powerful. States will establish control over churches, in part to gain access to church wealth, to church land. And they will also, as they become centralized, which I mean by that the central government gains more power, essentially that kings become more powerful against people like aristocrats and so forth. They will also become better at collecting taxes, in part because they need them for wars, right? So one thing we want to emphasize is that Europe is often at war, and this is one reason why they're going to become so powerful. They get really good at fighting and at developing technologies that lead them to become even better at fighting. So states will establish more control over churches and become better at collecting taxes. And states who do this well will absorb smaller states. So if your government is not good at centralizing, is not good at raising taxes, you will eventually be defeated and absorbed by a government that is good at doing these things, right? So in this time period, in kind of, like I said, going along with these economic revolutions, we also have political revolution, which leads in the result of centralized states, centralized governments. Now, one thing I want to stress, and I'm simplifying things here. There's going to be essentially two kinds of centralized states that are going to develop, and I'm going to look at particularly at the centralized state that develops in France and the one that develops in England. And these are two different kinds of centralized states, and it's very important that you understand the differences and why they're important. So starting with France, the example I like to give is Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King. And Louis XIV had a very high view of the monarch. He had a very high view of himself. You can see in that image on the left, he is presenting himself as Apollo, the Greek god of the sun. And he was often called the Sun King, meaning a person who was brilliant and powerful. And Louis XIV is going to advocate two kind of concepts that are connected in terms of his centralized state. One is royal absolutism, which means that I can do whatever I want because I'm the king, right? Royal, in this case, means king. Absolutism means absolutely anything I want. So the king can do as the king wants. That's the political theory. So you have a centralization of the state, of the government around the king, who can do whatever he wants. And if you were to say, well, king, why should I follow you? Why can you do whatever you want? The king would say, because God chose me. I have the divine right to be king, right? I have the divine right to be king. God has chosen me, so you have no right to question me. So because of this, the duty of the people, the subjects of the king, are to obey the king and pay their taxes. And this is kind of a one-way trip, or one-way route, I should say. The people are supposed to obey. The king tells them what to do, right? The people aren't supposed to talk back. They do what the king says. And very few people actually have a say in what the government does. It's mostly in France the higher nobility and the church leaders who are able to have some say in the government, but for the most part, it's the king. Everyone else is his subject, and they have to do what he says. Now, if you are a king, this looks like a really cool model, right? I mean, this is very attractive to kings because, I can do whatever I want, and your job is to listen to me and pay taxes so I have the money to do whatever I want. And if you question me, well, you have no right to question me because God has chosen me. I'm working for God, not for you, in a sense. So a lot of monarchs really admire this and will try and imitate France's royal absolutism. And there will be debates about this in Britain, and I tend to use Britain and England interchangeably because of the complex relationship between England and Scotland and Northern Ireland and so forth. But just so you know, I tend to, for our purposes, they mean essentially the same thing. And there are going to be a series of civil wars in Britain between a king. I'm not going to give you too many details here because I want to keep things fairly simple, who believes in more of an absolutist view, who thinks that he should get to do what he wants because God has chosen him, and Parliament. And if you're not familiar with Parliament is kind of the elected officials in England. It's like a Congress, and that represents the idea of popular sovereignty, that power comes from the people. So there's this kind of dueling views of what the government should be like in Britain. And I want to stress, I'm oversimplifying things, but I need to do that to make things clear. Between the king, who says sovereignty, power, authority comes from God, and his right to rule comes from God, and Parliament, the elected officials, who say, no, the right to rule comes from the people. You rule on behalf of the people and are ultimately responsible to the people. Right? So there's this question, where does legitimacy, where does sovereignty reside? Is it with the king, who rules based on belief that God has chosen to be king, or does it go with the people? And this is connected closely to issues of taxes, right? Taxes are needed in particular during times of war. And these civil wars are actually related in part to taxes about how to deal with other wars, just to make things really complicated. That's why I try and simplify things here. But the basic idea here is that in Britain, you're going to have civil wars over whether you should have a centralized government based around the idea that the king is an absolute monarch with divine right, or whether his right to rule is limited by an elected parliament, and that ultimately the government gets its power from the people. And in the particular issue that this is often based around is the idea of how you collect taxes and how they are spent. In royal absolutism, like in King Louis XIV, the king gets to decide who pays what taxes and how they're spent. In a parliamentary system, the parliament gets to decide who pays what taxes and how they're spent. And to give you a concrete example, the United States Congress is essentially in charge of taxation. We follow more of that parliamentary view. So that's kind of what's at stake in these British civil wars. Are we going to be a centralized state similar to what France is, or are we going to develop something else based around parliament? Now, an important philosopher who plays a role in the victorious settlement, in Parliament's victory in determining how English government should be arranged, and who will inspire the American revolutionaries, is a man named John Locke. And Locke is a fascinating philosopher. He's shaped by the Civil Wars and is developing his philosophy in reaction to them. He argues that the fundamental purpose of a government is to protect property. Right? The fundamental purpose of a government is to protect property. If a government doesn't do that, then people can disband that government and establish a new government. And this also is related to the idea of taxes, right? If a government takes your property in the form of taxes unfairly, does not allow you to have a say in how those taxes are spent, well, that's wrong, and you can resist and even overthrow that government. Right, so ideas of property and taxes are closely connected because taxes are essentially taking your property, and if a government is not protecting your property, if it's taking away your property in the form of taxes unfairly and not giving you a say in how those taxes are spent, well, that's a problem. That's not a good government. And Locke even develops ideas of freedom, particularly freedom of speech, around this idea of defending property, because if I don't have freedom to speak out if someone, including the government, is taking my stuff unfairly, then that government can't possibly protect my property, right? I need freedom of speech to participate in politics in order to protect my property. What's really striking is since also he put property at kind of the center of his system, he was able to allow limited religious tolerance, right? Locke argued basically that as long as people's religion doesn't cause them to do bad things that hurt other people, they can just believe whatever they want. Now, like I said, this was limited because Locke didn't accept atheism. He said atheists can't take oaths because they don't believe in God, so they can't swear to God. And if you can't take an oath, we can't trust you. He also excluded Catholics because he thought they were connected to royal absolutism, which he didn't like. But still, for this time period, his willingness to tolerate lots of different kinds of Protestant Christianity, as well as Judaism, is important. And these ideas will be built on by other people in order to develop ideas of rights and democracy that are going to help lead to the American Revolution and to continued developments in democracy. And Locke's philosophy will be increasingly implemented in Great Britain because Parliament will win the civil wars. So it will be understood that sovereignty comes from it, that the king is under the law. The king can't do whatever he wants because God chose him to be king. Rather, sovereignty comes from the people and from the Parliament, which is representative of the people. And if you're not familiar with what a parliament is, it's basically the English Congress, right? So it's made up of officials elected by the people. What this means then is that more people will have a say in how government collects and spends taxes, particularly merchants. A lot of times what determines who has the right to vote, and not everyone gets the right to vote, is how much wealth they have, how many taxes they pay, right? The idea is that you pay a certain amount of tax, that gives you the right to vote because you're a property owner and governments exist to protect property. So while from our perspective, this is kind of problematic because, we would argue today that everyone should have the right to vote. And this is limiting who can vote based on how much money they have, how wealthy they are. The key point is this represents an expansion. More people will have a say in how governments collect and spend taxes, particularly these merchants, which means that increasingly the government is going to favor policies that benefit merchants, that benefit business. And also there's this idea of freedom of speech, that you are able to speak your mind in terms of politics to a wider degree than you could before. And one thing we also have to emphasize that makes democracy so important is that by getting people together to talk about their problems that their constituents in the country faces and getting that information out there, they can resolve that conflict through compromise. Right? So instead of having a civil war or rebellion over government policy, you're able to get people together in the same room, get them to talk out a compromise, and then you can deal with these problems that way. Right? So basically the idea is that you get the conflict out there, you have mechanisms to resolve conflict, and through those mechanisms you can have greater stability because you can deal with problems other than by fighting or having a civil war or rebellion. So democracy often isn't pretty because it involves people like shouting and arguing with each other and lots of politics. But the key thing is it's a peaceful means of resolving conflict. And that will help governments have greater stability because it's much easier, to deal with that kind of problem than it is dealing with a civil war or a rebellion. Also, what's important in particular for England is, like I said, that there's going to be this alliance between the government and business because you have all these merchants who have increasing power because they have money. That's going to lead to the economy to develop more and will lead to England becoming increasingly wealthy. Now, not everyone is going to enjoy this wealth, but over time, more and more people will. This is just kind of the beginning. So we've talked about two different centralized forms of government. England, which is going to emphasize more of this kind of parliamentary system, this kind of democracy, or France, which emphasizes royal absolutism and divine right. Now, what we've also talked about so far is this idea of mercantilism, where colonies give you wealth, they give you resources, which give you power. The more colonies you control, the more wealth you have, the more powerful your armies are. If you have a colony, someone else doesn't have it, so that means they're going to have less money and less power, so you can fight them in war. And remember, there's also this competition for colonies that will lead to colonial wars because these things give you wealth. So kind of keep that in mind in the background. So we had this question then, which is going to be better, right? Is French absolutism going to make you a powerful government, or is British liberty? And one thing about history, this maybe isn't the best way to determine which system is better, but you can kind of see which system is more powerful through wars. So we're going to look at a mercantilist war, a war fought over colonies. In the United States, we call this the French Indian War because that's what we experienced it as, but this was actually part of a wider colonial war called the 7 Years' War, which took place not only in North America, but in the Caribbean and even in India between France and Great Britain. And this is essentially a war over colonies. And what's fascinating about this war, and one reason this is important for us understanding the power of Europe, is understanding why it is that even though France has a larger army, navy, and economy, Britain wins this war. Right? So I want to stress this. It's not simply the amount of resources you have, it's how you use them. France, going into this war, had a larger army than Britain. It had a larger navy than Britain. It had a larger economy than Britain. Everything about France was bigger than Britain. But Britain wins. Right? Britain is going to win this war. And the quick answer why is because the system of democracy, of liberty, allows you to more effectively mobilize your economy than this system of absolutism does. Right? And this is going to give us a clue not only about who wins this war and why, but also why the European powers are going to become so much more powerful, right? This is part of this political revolution we've been talking about, and we can see how it leads directly to power. And of course, also it connects to the economic revolution we've been talking about. So the key thing, if we want to understand why England, even though it was smaller than France in terms of population, its economy was smaller, its army was smaller, its navy was smaller, it was still able to win. And that has to do with the connection between the economic and the political revolutions that we've been discussing, right? So this has to do with how the politics and economics works together. But the key thing I want to stress first is that democracy, in a sense, leads to trust, right? Democracy leads to trust. Why? Well, in democracy, people have a say in their government, right? People have a say in their government. And government officials have to listen to the people who elected them, or they will not be reelected, right? A king, remember, like an absolutist king, like Louis XIV, can say, I'm going to, you're going to pay this tax, and I get to decide how it's spent. Well, and if you complain, I'll just say, well, God chose me, I'm the king, you just got to do what I say. That doesn't lead to much trust, especially when you see the king living in a fancy palace and not necessarily spending the money on what he says he's going to spend it on. In democracy, though, it leads to trust because, like I said, people have a say in their government. Not all people necessarily, but some people, and usually it's the most powerful, wealthy people who would have the most impact anyway. And government officials have to listen to them because if they don't, and if they continue not to listen to their constituents, they will not be reelected. So that builds a kind of trust. It builds a kind of two-way conversation, right? Government officials have to listen, elected government officials have to listen to their constituency or they will not be reelected. So that helps bring a kind of trust. My government official has to listen to me, especially if I'm part of a larger group who is demanding some change. And I'm saying, hey, I think we should raise taxes in this way to spend money on this kind of program. If there's enough people like me, the government has to listen to me. So government officials are more willing to listen because if they don't, they won't be reelected. Now, why is this buildup of trust so important? Well, we only loan money to people we trust will pay us back. Right? You maybe knew someone in high school or even now in college who was always asking to borrow money but wouldn't pay it back. They would ask you for $5, you loan them $5. The next week they want another $5, you loan it to them. Then that week after that, they want more money. And you say, no, I'm not going to loan you any more money because you won't pay me back. On the other hand, when you had people who would pay you back, you're more willing to loan them money. So we only loan money to people we trust will pay us back. In France, no one really trusted the king. They refused to loan money to the king because the king would do things like not pay them back. He would say, well, I'm the king, I don't have to pay you back. And of course, people would did not want to loan money to the king. Sometimes he would try and force them to, but sometimes they would figure out ways to avoid it. But the key thing is, French people did not want to loan money to their king because they didn't believe the guy would actually pay them back. And even if they did loan money to the king, they didn't really have a say in how it was spent. But in England, things were completely different. People were willing to loan money to the government because they, in a sense, were the government. And if the government were to say, well, thank you for the money, we're not paying you back, people would say, aha, really? Well, we're just going to elect new officials who will pay us back. Right? We will just elect new officials who will pay us back. And essentially what happened in England was the government sold bonds. They sold bonds for a particular purpose. And a bond is essentially a loan to the government. Basically you would buy a bond, from the government. And when you buy the bond, the government promises, okay, you're buying this bond for like £100. In 5 years, we will pay you £120. And we're selling this bond in order to raise money to buy a navy. So there's a kind of trust there. The government makes a promise, and it's going to raise this money from me. It's going to pay me back with interest, and it's going to use this money for a certain purpose. So English people, because of this, were willing to trust their government. Like I say, if the government tries not to pay back the bonds, those government officials will find themselves not reelected, and they will elect officials who will pay back the bonds. And this allows England to raise more money to build up its army and navy despite being smaller than France. So it will often have an army or navy as big or bigger than France, even though they have less people and less population, because they trust their government, because it's a representative government, and they're therefore willing to loan it the money it needs to fight this war, which will allow Britain to become victorious, and will do things like allow them to seize Canada and drive the French out of India, which will give them even more power. But in particular, right, you can see through this war how there's this relationship between these economic and political revolutions that, if you undertake, give you power. It allows a small country like Britain to use its resources more effectively to fight a war across the world, right? They're not just fighting they're mostly fighting in North America, the Caribbean, and India, and defeat a larger, more wealthy country, right? That's the power of these political and economic revolutions we've been talking about.